We have the amazing Stewart Lyons here.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
And if this is correct, you have produced every episode of Breaking Bad.
I was unit manager on that.
On this one.
But basically did the same things from that point, kept getting promoted all the way through the end.
That is amazing.
The show. But I did every single episode.
That is amazing. And every single episode is fantastic.
Thank you. Yes, quite a ride.
So why don't we just start off, talk about the role of a producer in television. What is your job and what do you oversee in that position?
Well, you see a lot of people who have producing titles in TV, and it's a little hard to differentiate, if you're the viewer, who's doing what. There is the person, Vince Gilligan in this case, who came up with the idea of Breaking Bad, wrote the pilot script, and then went on to oversee the entire show, casting every part of it, and from Los Angeles mostly. So he was the creative soul of the show. There were people who helped Vince get that project sold. You see Mark Johnson, Grand Via Productions, his number one person, Melissa Bernstein. They also helped organize the creative thing of the show. My responsibility is as the person who's doing all of the operations, hiring the crew, finding the people who will then find the locations, build the sets, budgeting it, scheduling it, and then overseeing the actual shoot to make sure that everybody's playing nice, that we're getting the best possible results. There are other producers noted there. Karen Moore was the line producer on that. She did the first 2 seasons and then I took over. And you see that credit is produced by, and there's usually only one produced by credit, and that's the line producer. So all of the people who are above the line, that's a thing on the budget form, are the actors, directors, the writers, the producers. And the people below the line are all the crew, all the people who do the heavy lifting of the actual day-to-day film. So I am the line producer. So they all report to me.
That's fantastic. And why don't we just go back to this pilot? How did you even get involved? I mean, how did this all come to be?
It was an executive at Sony who I knew, who had seen my work over years, but we've never been able to connect. And he said, listen, we're going to do something in New Mexico. Have you shot there? And I said, no. And have you ever run a show out of town before? I said, no. He said, okay, why don't you go meet Vince Gilligan in January of 2007 and see if you guys hit it off. And if you do, we'll see what happens. So I went out to New Mexico, Albuquerque, and met Vince. And we decided we both didn't like sports, and
there you go.
We both like Scotch, and we both like Scotch at 6,000 feet of altitude, especially, and we really hit it off. And the next day he said, well, I'm going back to LA, and I said, okay, I'll be coming. And no, you stay here. And so I stayed in Albuquerque and started doing the show, which was terrifying.
I bet. And when you met, was this Vince's first movie series that he directed, or was?
First, actually, he had done a series that didn't last for more than a few episodes. But I don't even know what the name of that was. He had written 2 movies that got made, and then his career went in the dump for a couple of years. And his agent got him a job on The X-Files.
Okay.
And Vince is brilliant. He's just amazingly talented and a nice person. And he very quickly became the number 2 person on The X-Files. And he did that for a couple of years, I think like 4 years. And then he didn't work again for a couple of years. And it wasn't looking too great. And he was having a conversation with another writer friend of his, Tom Schnoz. And Tom said, well, listen, Vince, if this continues, our careers are in the toilet. We might as well go make crystal meth. And they hung up the phone, and about 2 weeks later, Vince called back Tom and said, I think I could do something with that idea. Which is my bad interpretation of Vince's Virginia accent. And that was the start of it. But then it took a couple of more years for the project to get going because it got rejected everywhere. Everywhere, except for FX. And FX had it for a year, and then they said, no, we're not going to do it.
Right.
And that seemed to be the end of it. And then an executive who had been at FX, this is the real story on it, went to AMC. And AMC at that point had never done a TV series. They would later do Mad Men, and then we were in the #2 series. And that executive was asked by his boss, was there anything that you wanted to make that didn't get made? And he said, yeah, Breaking Bad.
Wow.
And that's how it kind of got rolling. You see all these kinds of weird coincidences and people hooking up in strange ways. But that was the way everybody kind of came to the show.
Okay. And then there's also a story. How did with Sony? I mean, the famous story with Michael Linton and Sony. How did were they partnering with AMC? Is that?
Yeah, they partnered with AMC.
Okay. And did they? I always, because in retrospect it seems like a no-brainer. But at the time, did everyone think this was the next big thing?
No, I mean Michael Linton said, and I had mentioned this just as the introduction, that Michael Linton, when he was pitched this idea, said it was the single worst idea that he had ever heard in the history of television. And then he turned to two of the executives and said, okay, we'll make it, and if it fails, you're fired. Which isn't what I think is of a great management, but Michael Linton's very successful, so what do I know?
Yeah, he's done right. Okay, so Vince goes back to LA. You're New Mexico.
Yes.
Handed the script. What were the challenges, just as the producer, like when you're out there yourself now putting this together? Could you talk? Was it, just the whole process of like? Did you think that this was going to be?
It just went so smoothly. Yep. Like on day 2, I called up my wife and I said, "I've made a terrible mistake. I got to get out of this." So she deserves all the credit for why I stayed on the show. She said, "Stick with it for a little bit." But look, we didn't have a studio. I didn't know anybody in New Mexico to do the show. We didn't have offices.
Didn't have offices.
Basically, I started the show with a cell phone and my hotel room, and that's pretty much what we started. But 6 weeks after that point, we had 125 people on payroll. We had offices set up. We built the first sets in a warehouse that didn't even have running water. We had porta potties on wheels that were outside the soundstage. The wheels got stolen by probably somebody using meth. And we started shooting the show. Wow. And the first day was the meth lab bust. That was the first day of production.
And why did you choose that as your first?
That's its own kind of art. You want to start off with something that has a little punch to it, mm-hmm. so that the studio can see that you're really on top of it. You don't want to make it too challenging. You also want to introduce most of your main characters.
Right.
The other part is we're busy building the Walter White House. The Walter White House was an interesting thing. When you're shooting, particularly a story set in a lower income home, it's very hard to fit in 45 people and 2 cameras and have it air conditioned and have the walls move. I mean, this is not going to happen. So I made the decision that we'll find the exterior and we'll use that, but we'll build an interior. And the interior of the Walter White House is completely different than the actual interior of the actual house. But we did it that way. We wound up building the Walter White House, or I should say we wound up building it once, taking it apart, and then reassembling it 6 times.
Wow.
Because we never knew the show was coming back.
Right.
So we always would have to strike off of our sets, mm-hmm. Strike all of our sets off the sound stages, hand the sound stages over, and then reassemble them when we got the final word. It was only when we started season 5. We could have been canceled after 4, but when we started season 5, we knew we were going to do the whole last run, because that was 2 sets of 8 episodes, and that's how we did it.
Right, which is
yeah.
It's incredible. And it's, when you mentioned the Walter White's house, now the other most iconic set, if you call it that, is the RV. Talk about how did you pick that RV? Is there a story behind that, or and were there many RVs and all of that? Like, was it a set too?
It was a set.
It was a set. So the inside was set.
So the inside, because shooting in an RV is even worse than shooting in a lower income home. I mean, it's like a little can. You have to move the walls. You have to get the cameras in there. You have to get enough air. Killing the actors is just, well, if it's the last scene, maybe, and you don't like them, maybe, but generally you'd keep them alive.
Yeah.
So we built that, and so you see the bodies sloshing around.
Right.
That was done on a soundstage. We put Teflon on the floors. We put outrigger pieces of wood outside. We put them on wires. And everybody on the crew was on one wall or another, and we were yelling at each other, okay, up, left, up, down, up, right, and pull, and it was also, we couldn't afford a gimbal, a real thing that tilts and you just press buttons. So I came up with the idea, we'll put it on a big inner tube. So we put it on a big inner tube, we reduced the amount of air in it, and that's how we got the whole thing to slosh and move. It's really kind of what we call poor man's process.
That's fantastic. Well, that's producing.
That's producing.
That's
yeah,
fantastic.
You can't get it, so that's what we could do.
Okay, was there any other issues during the shoot? You said I think it was a 14-day or 13?
It started off, I think, as a 13-day shoot. Vince got ill. The scenes you see, the fire trucks going by, that was, I don't know, probably about day 11. And he got the flu, and I have pictures of him just all wrapped up and completely miserable. And one of the firemen was a safety officer. Now, Vince was refusing to go home. He was spiking a fever, and he was really miserable. And the fire safety officer basically said, I'm a health official for this county, and you're going home.
Wow.
Kicked him off his own set. And that's how Vince went back. I directed some of the drive-by shots that you see.
Okay.
We got the shots of the smoke coming out of the RV. We really added a lot of texture. We shot all the weird trees that we could. That's in an Indian reservation, a Navajo Indian reservation called Tahajali, and it's about 40 miles from Albuquerque. It's a beautiful place, and anyway, so that was the biggest bump I think we ran into. There are always bumps. Look, you go to a school district and you say, I'd like to shoot here, and they go, great, what's the movie? Well, it's about drugs. Oh, it's against drugs. Well, so we had some difficulty getting permission to shoot places.
Right.
But New Mexico was making a really big commitment to trying to get productions to come in, and we had great cooperation from our city contacts, Ann Lerner and a few other folks, and we got to places. But in the beginning, we sometimes would want to go up to a church and say, we just want to park our crew here, and we're going to pay you, a couple $1,000s for that. And they would say, no, you're doing a show about meth. And then by the end of the show, at the end of the series, they were saying, would you please come and use our parking lot?
Because we're going to have tourists in a few years. Come here.
Tell you who we got great cooperation from is the DEA.
DEA.
The DEA thought this show was great because it didn't glorify anything. It wasn't Miami Vice. It was a very real depiction of what happens in that world. And they gave us a lot of very good cooperation and would send advisors. And none of the advisors looked like DEA agents. I mean, some of them looked like your grandmother. It's really scary.
That's fantastic. Okay, so you finished the pilot.
Right.
Then what happens? You wait. When did you know the show got picked up?
Let's see. We finished shooting in March. I was there till April, kind of cleaning up. It was snowing in April. I remember that. And then I don't think we got the word to come back until July.
July, okay.
And then I drove out to New Mexico and started prepping in August. And then we did the first 6 or 7 episodes. I think it's 6, pilot plus 6. And then the Writers Guild strike happened.
Oh, right. That was.
And we all went home.
All went home, right.
And then we got permission to do the second season. And then it looked really dicey for the third season. And that's when Netflix bought the show. Started the third season, and that changed a lot.
So Netflix took over the show. I
Didn't take it over,
But-
but they bought the rights to
Stream,
stream it.
Okay.
And it became one of their biggest hits. As a matter of fact, it was their only real hit for a while, and it served to get the show into, or to get Netflix into Europe.
Wow.
Was the Breaking Bad.
That's fascinating, because I knew it went on Netflix, and I knew that kind of started the binging culture.
Yeah.
With Breaking Bad, because everybody was binging Breaking Bad and saying, "What a fantastic show this is! Why haven't I seen it?"
That's right. It started binging culture.
Yes, which it's fascinating.
So I'll apologize for that right now.
Yeah, we debate. I like Game of
So
Thrones.
you guys
once a
used to
week.
have lives until that happened.
Could you talk about, because for everyone here, the workflow on a series? Like, so it's fast paced, right? And
Extremely.
And talk about how many episodes do you have to shoot, and how does that work? Is that like shooting back-to-back movies, or
The way Breaking Bad worked was
Okay.
kind of almost a traditional model of you doing one episode at a time.
Okay.
Sometimes now they're doing 2 episodes at a time. That's called crossboarding, where you treat both episodes under one director as kind of a single movie. And even now we're doing, started with, I think, I may get the name wrong. Was it True Confessions or True Crime?
True crime?
True Crime. Yeah, that started one director doing 8 episodes, which were fully cross-boarded.
Sorry, True Detectives. You're correct.
True Detectives, yeah. And that's a very difficult model. But basically, what happens is the writers start writing a couple of months ahead of production. And the first thing they have to decide is, what's the arc of the entire season? Where are we going to wind up? And then they kind of break that down into beats, and then each of those beats becomes an episode. And then they break each of those beats down. And you call it breaking it down. They actually write on, they sit in a room, and there's one person taking notes, and all the writers are talking ideas. And as the ideas start kind of riffing and coalescing, once they get the idea for a scene, it's written on a 4x6 card and put on a corkboard. And you build your act structure just like that. And I have pictures of those corkboards, because I thought they were, I pretty quickly figured this might be a very important show. So I made sure the corkboards were there. Then that episode is given to one of the writers in the room, who goes away and then comes back with a draft. And then that draft gets worked on by the group. And finally, after a couple of other iterations, it goes to Vince for his, he used to say, it goes through his typewriter. Then nobody has a typewriter anymore. Right. And at the same time, you're starting to get notes from the studio. Okay, so once the script starts coming out, even in the outline form, I'm beginning to get word of what they're going to need. Locations is starting to work. You know, our wardrobe people are starting to work once we know we have our cast. Bryan Cranston wasn't cast until 2 weeks in front of the production. Wow. So some of this comes later on. The director shows up 8 days in front of the show before you start shooting. And immediately you start having meetings to get, now remember, the director is freelance. He's only going to do that episode for maybe out of the whole season. So Vince has the vision of the whole show. Vince has to help the director kind of get the vision, because each episode has to absolutely connect with the one that went before and the one that's going after. And that's part of that responsibility. At the same time, I'm getting the locations, the local casting, the extras, taking care, of the construction, determining which sets are going to be built and which sets we're going to find on location. They're called practical sets. Making sure all the permissions are going. And then we have more and more meetings that break it down even further. You know, that gun. You know, who picks that gun? Who picks all of the guns? Well, the prop person assembles, choices, and then we pick it. Who picks the car? Well, the transportation guy comes up with a whole bunch of different cars that fit the character of Walter White. Remember, this is a guy who was brilliant, but completely unsuccessful. So that is probably the worst looking car in America. And with a custom color that was just awful. But we had to paint the car. So, I mean, all of these things are choices. Every piece of wardrobe is a choice. Everybody who says a single line is a choice. The stunt people are a choice. And all of those choices have to get made in 8 days prior to the start of production.
Wow.
So that's what we do. And then once we start shooting, we're watching not only that shot, but I'm also on the next episode. Mm-hmm. And once we get to the third episode, I'm not only doing the next episode, I'm wrapping out, making sure that everything is okay and we can come back to wherever we've been, or if anybody's had a problem, I address it. And then looking down the line to future episodes and always trying to stay one step ahead. And at the same time, dealing with whatever issues come up. Did anybody else get sick? Is the weather going to be bad? Do we need to go to a cover set? We didn't finish the day. How are we going to do that? How are we going to fit things in the schedule? There was a scene that was written in the pilot, if you've watched the series, where I went to Vince and I basically said, there is absolutely no way I can fit this into the 14 days. I just can't. It's a full day in itself. And that scene was a gas station being blown up. Mm-hmm. And Vince finally said, okay, we'll take it out. And then used it in the third episode down.
Okay.
But it was a combination of, kept coming to me and saying, why can't we fit this in? Why, you're the one directing, you want to go that fast? And no, you can only go a certain degree fast.
And you do those episodes over about 2 weeks, or is it vary, per
First
what's in the
season,
script?
they were all done in 8 days. Second season, I think they were all done in 8 days.
8 days.
Except for one that was done in 9. The third season, they were mostly 8 days.
That's amazing.
Some 9 days. Fourth season, I think the same thing. By the fifth season, we were, I think, up to about 9 days an episode. And now it's not unusual to do 10-day episodes. And of course, with Game of Thrones, they did one episode that was 60 days. But
Right.
nobody has seen that episode, actually. It's been broadcast, you just couldn't see it.
Oh, the night game.
The night thing.
Yeah.
Nobody's seen the episode. I was like, what? It's not my TV, dude.
Well, we're going to get to the perfect season finale that I've
Yes.
seen in television, because
Yes.
it's not easy to do. But, is it, when are the directors basically scheduled before the scripts are written?
Yes.
They are.
They're booked months in advance.
So, which leads me to my next question. So, you book your directors, then the writers are working on the scripts and all that,
Yeah.
and you're prepping, and the directors show up. So, for example, when Rian Johnson gets his script, so to speak, to shoot, it's completely arbitrary, the script that he got. Is that?
Yes.
Okay. That's
Yeah, I
interesting.
mean, basically, you're going to have a big season opener, you're going to have a big season ending, and Vince wanted to usually direct those.
Okay.
He didn't get to direct the last episode of the first season because, we had the plug pulled because the Writers Guild strike happened. He didn't get to do the next season because he was still busy writing the script. But aside from those things, yes, it's a bit of a degree of luck as to who gets which script.
That's really interesting.
And you can get a bad script, and if you're a beginning director and you can't make that work, it's a problem, and it's not your fault.
So Rian Johnson got the bottle episode,
The Fly.
Talk about that.
Okay, well, we were going over schedule and over budget, and I think that in a couple of seasons, so by the third season, there was a lot of pressure to kind of keep the show directly on schedule. Actually, we did great the second season. The first season was a little problematic. The third season was getting to be. And Vince had anticipated this, so we did what's called a bottle show, which means basically everything is like one set with your series regular actors, and you try and keep it as controlled as possible. Well, the bottle episode takes place in the meth lab, the super meth lab that they built after the destruction of the RV, which happened in season 2. Spoiler alert. I was supposed to say that before. Anyway, we built a super duper meth lab, and we basically had Bryan and Jesse cooking meth and just riffing about where their lives were going at the same time that they were being bothered by a fly. And that was the episode. And Rian Johnson, it was his first episode of television. He had done a couple of low-budget movies. And he came in, and, you know, if there was ever a script to panic a director, they don't get panicked as much by, okay, there's going to be a big fight scene. They get panicked when there's no visual there. And yet he took it on. He was just a pleasure to deal with. He's brilliant, and he's a lovely person. And he knocked it out of the park. And then he went on, to, I think, to do one other episode for us before he did the third episode to the end of the series, which was called Ozymandias, which, in my opinion, if you ever get to it, and I hope you will, it's the single best episode of one-hour television that I've ever seen, let alone produced.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, he's just great. And then his career went in the toilet, and he's doing some Star Wars thing now. I really feel bad for him.
Oh, Knives Out's an excellent film, too.
You know, such a shame. He was such a nice guy.
And while we're on directors, because I find it just very interesting how that works.
Sure.
There were many other directors. Like Bryan Cranston actually ended up directing a few, and I believe you might have directed a few as well.
No, I didn't.
Okay.
I directed a lot of what's called second units.
Second unit, okay.
You know, when you see that ambulance drive by, and that's me.
That's great. That's great.
The whole show is about that ambulance drive, and a few of the RV driving by. So, Bryan directed. He's a terrific director. Vince directed. Most of the writers wound up directing. And then we had a few repeat directors. Johan Ronk was one of our repeat directors, and he did Chernobyl, and he's won every single award in the last year for that.
I forgot about that.
He did a few of those. Adam Bernstein was a go-to guy for us. Michelle McLaren directed more episodes than anybody else, and she's a force of nature. She's brilliant.
Is she a writer as well, or is she?
No, she came out of line producing.
Okay.
But she wanted to concentrate on directing, and she and Vince had worked together on The X-Files for years.
Okay.
So when she came in season 3.
Which leads me to, so, you know, I guess sometimes you see these movies like Lord of the Rings, and it's, you know, when you just go back to back. Does it ever get easier as the seasons go on, or is each season a challenge unto itself?
Breaking Bad was never easy. Ever.
Never easy.
Ever.
Okay.
Ever. It was not user-friendly. If you were there, you were always being challenged to do better and better work. And I think that together with a couple of other series, we broke the mold of what was possible quality-wise in television. First off, the writing. Everything depends on the writing. Everything. And then after that, you have casting and directing and then the look of the show. But the writing is the foundation, and the writing was just simply brilliant and complex. And I'm looking at some of the topics and nuanced stuff in the pilot. I haven't seen the pilot in a couple of years. Knowing that we built on those things moving forward. And so, I'm sorry, I got a little lost.
Oh no, that's great. But you did use. It was the same crew, pretty much. Did you interchange that much?
John Toll shot the pilot, and John Toll only has 2 Oscars, and so he wasn't going to be our regular cinematographer. And then we had one gentleman the first season, and then we wound up with Michael Slovis, who did seasons 2 through 6.
Okay.
Or 2 through 5, however you want to count it. And he stayed almost to the end. So that was, when he came in, we changed over about half the crew. By season 3, we almost made no changes from that going forward.
Okay.
So we had our group. And that's the purpose of it. That's the great thing about TV series, and is that as you go on, you identify people who, you know, are ready for a promotion, and you know them, and you can give them a chance. And among them was me. I got to produce it. So that worked for a lot of people, and a lot of these same people that I hired in in season 2 are still working on Better Call Saul, and it's
Right.
now 11 or 12 years later. And nobody in New Mexico had ever heard of that. Before we started, there hadn't been a TV series really there. And we were the first. And when I would talk to the crew about coming on the show, and I would make the deals with them, I would say, as they were leaving the room, I said, they thought they had a deal. I said, "You like the deal?" They said, "Well, I thought we had a deal." I said, "Yeah, we have a deal. Here's the thing. I don't want you to come back 3 or 4 years later and say you made a bad deal, or 3 months from now. We're going to be here for 5 years. Is there anything else that we need to do to make sure that don't feel that you've," and I use the term, I don't do deals like Trump. I don't do gotcha deals where you feel like an idiot 2 weeks later because you find out that there's oil underneath your land. I don't do deals like that. I know that I'm in television, not in features. I'm in for the long run, and I want the people who are working there to feel that they got a fair deal and that they can live with it and that they understand that we're in for a long-term relationship, which is unusual in show business.
Right. Well, that's fantastic.
That's the way I work.
I wish all producers would be like this. You can run into some or not. Talk about the turtle in the head.
Okay. So I get a call from Vince on a Sunday, and he's a writer. He likes to play the drama thing, and he says, "We're going to need a turtle." Okay, what kind of turtle? Well, actually a tortoise. Okay, what kind of tortoise? It's got to be a wild tortoise. Where's this wild tortoise live? He says Mexico. Okay, we're shooting in New Mexico, which is not new and it's not Mexico. That's their saying. I said, okay, it has to be something that lives in Mexico. What are you going to do with the tortoise? Okay, we're going to put a head on it. Anybody I know? And of course it was, why do I keep...
Danny Trejo?
Yeah, Danny Trejo. He wasn't cast at that point. I said, okay. He said, but we don't want to kill the tortoise. I said, oh, all right, that's good. And what I had to do was, at that point, look, nobody is born knowing how to put a tortoise in the desert with a head on it. I mean, this is just not something they teach you in film school unless you've made it part of the curriculum.
We've added that. Actually.
You've added that? Okay.
In the class
so you guys will all be prepared. But basically, what you learn to do as a producer is not necessarily have the answer, but you learn the process for finding out the answer. So the first thing was, what are the tortoises in Mexico? First thing I found out after I started looking that up is they're all endangered. You can't touch any of them. And they're too small to carry a head. But I did find out that there are wild tortoises that were brought from Africa. Yes, this is real. Okay. And that they live in the desert in New Mexico and Mexico. So we found somebody who had one of those as a pet. And then we figured out that the way of attaching, this was our special effects guy, if you take a toilet ring, they're soft, and you stick a toilet on top of it, well, we took the toilet ring, put it on the tortoise, and stuck a head on top of it. And that head is so realistic that Danny Trejo, who's quite a character, he has a tendency to get killed in most of his movies. He's borrowed the head back from us, from Sony, and we did that. But of course, the tortoise, this was winter, we were shooting this, and they're cold-blooded, so we had to get a special heated trailer just for the tortoise.
A single trailer.
And then we had to explain the scene to the tortoise, because he had to go from point A to point B. Fortunately, romaine lettuce is the best argument for any tortoise that you want. You just hold the romaine lettuce, and once that critter sees that, he's moving. Until it gets cold, in which case they go.
That's fantastic.
So that's the tortoise story.
That's great. So I have to ask you, do you have any episodes that stand out as one of your favorites, maybe for personal reasons, or they were do you have anything that just in the back of your mind?
Well, I think that the train robbery episode was the most complicated production that we ever took on. Because, I mean, working with trains is really difficult. They're big, they're heavy. Once they get moving, they don't want to stop. Once they stop, they don't want to get moving. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of other conditions. They're robbing the train of chemicals. And the front of the train had to be in one position, and exactly over a bridge was where the chemicals were. So we had to figure that out in terms of the cars, because the cars are a different length. And then we had to find a length of track that we could control safely, because, as you know, in filmmaking, trains are very, very dangerous.
Right.
I mean, they are really dangerous. So we had to do that. And then there were other challenges to that episode. It was the only episode that we really did outside of Santa Fe versus outside of Albuquerque. So we have a crew, about 2/3 of the crew are New Mexicans, but about 1/3 are from California, from New York, from everywhere. We had to take a crew that was on distant location, change their location to Santa Fe, and then get them to this area of train track. And we could only use it from, I believe, 8 to 4. And at 4 o'clock, we had to clear the track. No questions, 4 o'clock. And then there were other challenges to it, like that was a first-time director.
Right.
And it was, George did a wonderful job on it. George Mastras did a fantastic job. And we had various units going to do a lot of pieces of it. So that was really, really complicated. And at the same time that's going on, I'm prepping the next show and showing up at 7 a.m. in Santa Fe, which was an hour away from Albuquerque. And it just...
Do you ever sleep? Do you just go? I mean, what is your 7 days a week?
Well, we do. That show was 5 days. Most shows now are 5 days a week. When I started, they were 6.
6.
But they're now 5.
Okay.
And you can start a typical 1-hour show at 6 a.m. on a Monday and do a 12-hour, 13-hour shoot. And then by Friday, because of turnaround and various union rules, you could be shooting 6 p.m., start at 6 p.m., and going to 6 a.m. on Saturday morning, and doing that kind of shifting constantly. Then you're crash and burn on a Saturday. Sunday is laundry, and then you go back 6 a.m. on a Monday. And there's, if you're on location, your time working may start at 6 a.m., but you need to get there.
Right.
And you need to drive home. And yes, exhaustion is a very real, I think it's the most dangerous part of show business.
Sure.
Certainly of television. Most dangerous.
Yeah, no, it's just, when you get into the production, it is just like being in a war zone sometimes. We're just going, trying to make it through the day. So
there's a lot of adrenaline.
Yep.
And the truth is that everybody there understands that. Look, it's the only job you go where not only do you not know when you know the day before when you're supposed to show up, and you pretty much know it after a pattern, but we'll tell you when you can have lunch, and we'll tell you when you can go home. And if there was a problem, some days went, on this show went 14 hours. We very rarely had a 16-hour day. We only did about 2 or 3 of those. But that's not uncommon. And just remember, if we have a 16-hour shoot day, those camera guys wrapping out have another hour of work. And the drivers have to wait till they're done.
Right.
And then the drivers have to show up an hour earlier than the crew. So, a lot of people say, what are all these drivers doing? They're doing nothing. Well, yeah, at this moment, they're doing nothing. And I would say to my transportation captain, if you ever have somebody sleeping on my job, let them sleep. Because if they need to be working, they'll be working. If they don't need to be working, I want them sleeping, because I don't want to get into a van driven by a driver who falls asleep.
Right.
So you have to manage the people needs, and you make sure that there's, of course, food look, I've shot in Chicago nights and winters. You got to keep people alive.
Right. Oh, I think your first shoot, you said you was here, which is a great story.
My first time I was in Chicago was that shoot. I'd have been in the business about 15 years by that point.
And it was, I think Jose had mentioned, it was minus 20 or 40.
Yeah. Nighttime on the top of a roof in Chicago in February gets even colder than this.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
We're going to have to wrap this up in a second.
Sure.
But, just you've been in the business now for many years. I'm sure this is kind of a generic big question, but have you seen a lot of change recently in how television is made? Is it?
It's changed a lot. I mean, we've moved from 3 networks basically to that had probably 20 series each, maybe 30, and now we are in a universe of 550 television series. This is scripted stuff.
That's amazing.
And that is a tremendous opportunity, but it's also harder. Most of those shows don't have runs of 22 episodes. They have runs of 8, 10. Now remember, nobody here on that show is staff. Nobody works for Sony. They work for the production. That means they get hired when we start prep, and they, the last day of shooting, they start being laid off. And within 4 weeks, they're all gone until the next show. So what I was doing in New Mexico for almost 9 years is I would find another show to roll people over onto, and I was keeping my crew together. But yeah, there are a lot of changes. I think that television is better than it's ever been.
Right.
I think that some of the series are just absolutely brilliant. I think that what you're watching is, I think 2 years ago, there were about 120 movies that were released that had the MPAA ratings, all the ratings, so they keep track. And this past year, it's about half of that number. But Netflix is making 50 movies alone. So 102 movies getting 50 movies are Netflix movies that are playing on Netflix, and of course Hulu and Apple and Amazon. They're all doing these things. So people are doing this. It's just they're watching it in different ways.
Right.
And that's changed some of the sensibility. Certainly, there's that birthday scene where she's doing the auction and he's thinking that he's going to have a fun night. That was cut out after the pilot was shown the first time because it was so controversial. And there are 2 scenes I thought were brilliant, and then I'll hand it back to you. One was that scene because it was like, my gosh, we can do this on TV. And the second scene, and this is where I really kind of realized that the show was beyond brilliant, was when Jesse is up on the cliff in Tajali and says, "Nothing here but those cows in a cow house." And I went to Vince and I said, how do you write a character who's so stupid he doesn't know the word barn? How do you do that? And he just smiled at me. I mean, and I still don't know how you do that. So that's the difference between his writing and anybody else.
Well, thank you so much. We're going to open it up now to, I'm sure we have many questions out there in the audience. I'm not sure how you want to handle the Q&A.
You do the honors. You pick.
I think, do you have a microphone set up, or how do we, I think they.
I'm going to come to the back here, guys, with the microphone.
Oh, okay. And now you're going to really get drilled here.
Okay. Look forward to it. You didn't comment on my socks.
Oh my goodness, yes, well, someone will have to ask Stewart about his socks. I had it
Breaking
written
Bad
down.
socks. You get a lot of swag on a show. But the socks weren't in those. But once I saw that they were selling Breaking Bad socks in Albuquerque, I just had to have a pair.
Water if you need some.
Thank you. Okay, questions?
Cool. Yeah, so huge fan of the show. It's
Thank you.
one of my favorites. But I just wanted to know, on set, when you're having a bunch of difficulties and things are going wrong, things are really stressful, how do you find it in yourself to continue going on, to stay focused, and even how do you watch other people cope with that and still be completely, creatively influenced and able to make it through the day?
Well, that's the trick. It really is a trick, because people would come up to me and there would be some big problems, or we're not going to be able to shoot and things like that. And my job is to say, okay, we're going to handle that. And meanwhile, I may be panicking, but I can't show that because that's not useful. You just let people know that no matter what happens, we're going to keep moving forward in the best possible way. And that, for me, safety is first. So if there's a lightning storm, I'm going to get people into shelter and make sure that people standing by metal poles that are holding lights aren't electrocuted. And if the schedule gets crunched, then that's show business. And if there's a different place to go to, and hopefully we've done the planning that allows us to move to a cover set, then we do that. And if an actor gets sick, I have to know the schedule well enough so that between myself and the first AD and the unit manager and the director, we can figure out alternate scenes and change the schedule around. So that when Vince got sick, we sent him home, and we still about had half that day. And there are some rules of what you can do and what you can't do. We couldn't direct the actors because that's something you can't do without the director there. But we could shoot a lot of texture, and we just kept the crew going. And we did that for a couple of days. And then Vince got better over the weekend, and then we started shooting. But, the nice thing about television for me is I don't start with a pile of money. We all, the studio and the production comes to an agreement about what each episode should cost. That's called a pattern. And then you do an episodic budget that shows what that episode's going to cost. And, some episodes are more expensive than others, and then some of them are less, and you just try and average to the pattern. And if you're going to run into a real problem, then you let the studio know, and everybody makes the best possible decision that they can for the show. Hopefully, with enough experience, you can anticipate many of the problems. But once you have a lot of experience, you have to be careful about anticipating problems that other people aren't aware of yet. I call that the problem of being prematurely correct. You have to allow people to understand that they're going over a cliff. You can't say, hey, there's a cliff. Too early. And then in terms of, again, getting back to that original thing when people come to you with problems, look, sometimes I refer to it as duck mode. The duck looks like it's quiet on the top and the feet are going underneath. And that's kind of what you try and emulate. But it takes experience, because sometimes it's hard to differentiate a temporary problem from a permanent one or a recurring one. And sometimes you see some problem and you go, well, is this the cause? And then sometimes you realize, well, maybe I don't have the right person handling that issue, and you have to address that as a producer and as a manager. Did that answer your question? Good.
Hey, thank you for coming. This is really fun. I love the show.
Great.
I have a lot of interest in this, but I will narrow it down to a question about humor.
Yeah.
What was your process, I guess generally, or specific examples of where the writers were writing a scene and maybe found humor in it that maybe wasn't initially imagined, or vice versa, where something was just supposed to be
I've got a great example for you.
Please.
I do. And I can claim credit for it.
All right.
We had a scene in the first season where we needed an attack dog. We actually needed a couple. And we were in New Mexico. Now, you have attack dogs in New Mexico. The problem is they tend to eat the person that they're attacking. Mm-hmm. And, we all like Jesse, so we didn't want him eaten.
I like him so much.
That's right. But it was going to cost us about $15,000 to get the dog in from Los Angeles to New Mexico. So when we were scouting, and this was a scene where the RV has been taken to a junkyard, and Jesse has no place to live. So he's going to try and get to the RV. In the original scene, as written, he jumps over a fence, gets attacked by these dogs, and barely gets to the RV. We saw that there were porta potties being stored for the entire city of Albuquerque right across the street. So what we did is, instead of the dog attack scene, which was going to cost too much, we got the porta potty up against the wall, and he went over the fence, stepped on the top of the porta potty, fell through the top, got covered with that green stuff and other stuff. Of course, it's all fake. It was a clean porta potty. And it just miserably climbs into the RV, dragging all that stuff. So that was an example of where we were able to find humor.
That's awesome.
As the show went on, there was less and less chance to find humor. But certainly in the first couple of seasons, I really enjoyed, I have a background in comedy. I really enjoyed the stuff that was just so funny, weird stuff.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey there.
Hi.
Thank you for coming, by the way. As someone who recently rewatched both shows and the movie, El Camino and Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, I was wondering, after watching both of them, there some throwaway lines that you would see in Breaking Bad actually came out as like bigger picture points that you could see in Better Call Saul and El Camino. And I was wondering, do you guys always have that vision in mind when you're making these shows? Like, are the plans always set forward at the beginning, or do you find yourselves rolling with it?
There's no riffing.
Yeah.
There's no improv.
Okay.
There's no I've got a better line. Because the problem in a serialized drama is you've got a train, it's got to go on that track, and the actor may think that they have a really good line, but they don't know where they're supposed to arrive 3 or 4 episodes down, and that quip might just throw them off to the side in a way. So you did not make changes. The actors, the directors did not make changes to the scripts. That was just not going to happen. And that was understood. Their job was to do the best possible version of the lines that they were given. That's not to say that there weren't some conversations earlier on about maybe this might work or that might work. But when you're on the set and you've got basically 120 people working and trying to get through the day, that's not the time that you start going, gee, I wonder if he did this instead of that. That's just not what you do. It's not what, unless that's built into the structure of the project. But when you're dealing with brilliant writing and scripts that have been studied and worked on for months, it's a little bit audacious to say, gee, I have a better idea at that moment, especially since you don't know where the train's going.
Right.
So, you know, not everything an actor does is genius.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for coming, as everyone
Sure.
was saying. Really quickly, I know you deal with a lot of like below the line positions too, but when the crew, when the production looks for directors to head on the project, how do you find one? Is there like a list that the DGA has, or is there like a list that Sony has that they recommend, or how does that process work?
It's a kind of a group decision. Certainly Vince had people that he knew and he had worked with, and Mark Johnson, who was a very experienced feature producer, was also had those people, and that's kind of how Ryan and Johan arrived with us. Vince knew Adam Bernstein. So it's a collaborative process that, let's say, there's going to be input from about 4 or 5 different sources. There's going to be your showrunner, who's going to have influences, and you know, let's just say that the showrunner could be hearing suggestions from his writing staff as to other directors who've done well. There is a Sony current executive who is providing names of directors that they've worked with, and that's coming in. The cable company could be suggesting other names. The actors could be bringing other names to Vince to consider. So they're coming in through there. The Directors Guild has nothing to do with this, except, of course, they represent every director. But if I wanted to hire you tomorrow as a director and go to the Directors Guild, knowing nothing about you, I could get you into the Directors Guild as a director, assuming I'm willing to now give you a $5 million production that you now have to do in 10 days, and you have the expertise to do that. Well, if you had said yes, you would have had a job, but you've lost it.
I highly recommend her.
However, if you wanted to be an assistant director, as first assistant director, it would take you 7 years of work to get there, or a unit manager. So those are lists that the Directors Guild, but the Directors Guild does not promote its members.
We have time for one last question.
Sure.
So, see that person right back there, student?
Hello. I wanted to ask about Better Call Saul.
Okay.
How do you, when I see a spin-off series, I tend to roll my eyes and, oh, okay, they're going to keep going with this idea. How do you take something like Breaking Bad and turn it into a spin-off and give it its own life and its own energy separate from the main series that was from?
Well, that's a very important question. Essentially everything comes from the writers. So I have the crew there, I have the stages there, but they have to come up with the creative vision. And frankly, these are guys who like to work without a net. And I say guys, half the writing group was women, were women, still are women. Essentially, it was their task, and in the beginning, they thought it'd be a half-hour comedy.
Really?
That didn't happen. And then they made it this huge character study of Bob Odenkirk's character. And I would say that it took them at least one, if not more than one season, to really get to the core of that show. That's structurally a more difficult show than Breaking Bad. Breaking Bad starts off with, you got 2 years to live. You've got no money. You've got no friends, because you don't see him with any other friends. He's like a stranger in his own home. He's got no life, really. And you got 2 years to live and solve that problem. That's a ticking clock. That's a great dramatic structure. Odenkirk's character in Saul has a bigger task because he has to keep you interested while he goes from a decent person to a bad person. But nobody's holding a gun to his head, and as a matter of fact, you know he survives Breaking Bad to wind up in a Cinnabon. So the idea that he's going to die isn't there. The idea that Walter White was going to die was possible in any episode. So I think it was a more difficult creative task, and it's up to the viewer to decide whether it was done as successfully as Breaking Bad. I did the pilot in the first season of Saul, and then I needed to finally come home and live in Los Angeles instead of being in New Mexico all my life. So I did come home, but it's a challenging show. My heart's in Breaking Bad, of course.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I appreciate it.